Alright guys, UFC 249 is behind us, and in the main event, we saw Justin Gaethje decimate Tony Ferguson with a 5th round TKO finish, ending one of the most impressive winning streaks in the lightweight division's history, and putting the final nail in the coffin of the most cursed matchup of all time. In this fight, Justin Gaethje showed the complete evolution of his game, from the reckless brawler that he entered the sport as, to the patient and technical counter-striker that has now earned a shot at the most prestigious title in the sport against one of the most dominant forces the division has ever seen in Khabib Nurmogomedov. Now, while the matchup that was never meant to be between Khabib and Tony Ferguson gave us plenty of variables to consider when breaking it down, Gaethje presents a completely different challenge to the champ that is much harder to analyze, and unfortunately, his recent fights don't tell us much about how this fight will go. Since entering the UFC, Gaethje's bouts have all been fought on the feet, against opponents who had no interest in trying to take him to the mat. Khabib's bread and butter is definitely in his wrestling and ground game, and though he does have decent striking, he's not on the same level as the rest of the top fighters in the division. And fighting against a powerhouse in Gaethje, whose striking is continuously improving, it wouldn't be wise to try to prove a point now. That being said, Khabib's takedowns and top control are some of the absolute best we've seen in the sport's entire history, and his ground and pound some of the most vicious. It's obvious to any fan where these two are going to want to keep this fight. It's all a matter of which one of them can implement their game. Can Khabib put Gaethje on his back, or can Gaethje defend Khabib's takedowns and force him to strike? Throughout Khabib's UFC career, only one fighter has been able to completely stop Khabib's takedowns. That fighter was Gaethje Tibau, in a fight that many fans to this day debate about who actually won. A lot of fans defending Khabib's performance in this fight like to point out that this fight took place before USADA was implemented in the UFC, and that Tibau was most likely on PEDs during this time. With Tibau testing positive for EPO years later, I wouldn't doubt or try to argue against this theory, but what I will say is that Tibau's success in defending Khabib's takedowns in this fight was mostly due to his superb balance as opposed to his brute strength, as Khabib went for numerous single leg attempts and just couldn't get Tibau off the other leg. I will also point out that this was only Khabib's second fight in the UFC, and since then he has shown much better technique in getting those single leg takedowns in. Since Khabib's fight against Tibau, he has been able to impose his will on every opponent put in front of him. But there's one major factor going into this fight with Gaethje that needs to be considered, and that's that Gaethje is going to be the most credentialed wrestler that Khabib has faced with his NCAA Division I background. That being said, it's hard to figure out just how well his wrestling translates into his MMA game because he doesn't use it. Gaethje is a durable heavy hitter and loves the stand-up aspect of MMA, so he's never looking to put his opponents on their back. And in turn, none of his opponents have bothered trying to put him on his back either. So there's really no meaningful grappling exchange to look at and try to analyze in his UFC career. Unfortunately, if we want to get any idea of how good his grappling is in MMA, we have to look early into his career and his days in the World Series of Fighting. And to be honest, if his ground game hasn't improved much since then, he won't have much to offer against Khabib. In these early fights, Justin Gaethje showed to have a great sprawl. When his opponents tried to shoot in for double legs, he had no problem brushing them off. However, when his opponents clinched with him and tried to drag him to the mat, he had the tendency to turn and give his back up, which is not something he's going to want to do against Khabib. Gaethje was able to get away with this against lesser opponents, but Khabib is a different animal. While Gaethje could possibly be the best wrestler that Khabib will have faced, Khabib is without a doubt the best wrestler and overall grappler that Gaethje will have faced. Khabib is not only a wrestler but also a submission artist. He is a Sambo expert and has a black belt in Judo, so Gaethje cannot afford to leave any openings for Khabib in these exchanges, or else Khabib will make it a quick night. Gaethje also wasn't immune to being taken down during this time, as we saw him put on his back on several occasions. At times, he was able to explode into reverse positions, but given how incredible Khabib's top control is, I don't see him allowing Gaethje to gain an advantage on him. When Gaethje wasn't able to escape from bottom position, he showed to have poor defense and constantly put himself in bad positions that Khabib would have no problem making him pay for. Now, what makes it hard to judge Gaethje based on these fights is the fact that this was very early into his career, and to be completely honest, his technique in just about every aspect of his game back then was abysmal, to put it bluntly. He was wild, he was sloppy, he kept his hands way too low, he overextended his strikes, and constantly put himself off balance. Just about every time he was taken down back then, it was due to his own recklessness rather than his opponent's skill. By all means, this is not the same fighter that would be looking to take the belt from Khabib. While Gaethje won these early fights almost purely based on his durability and athleticism, he continued to improve throughout his career. And after taking some tough losses in the UFC, he completely refined himself into the patient and calculated fighter that we see today. In this fight, Gaethje will not be putting himself on the ground for Khabib to jump in. Khabib is going to have to grab a hold of Justin Gaethje and try to force him to the ground. And if he can't, he'll be in for a long night. Now again, Khabib is not completely useless in the stand-up department. and we have seen him outstrike some of the most notable strikers in the game, such as Edson Barboza, Al Iaquinta, and even Conor McGregor. But his striking success relies heavily on the threat of his takedowns. No fighter in their right mind wants Khabib on top of them raining down blows, and once they felt his strength and his power on the ground, they're cautious of the takedown even when they're back on their feet, to the point where they can no longer get into their rhythm, are no longer able to put combinations together, and their guard is lowered as to anticipate Khabib shooting in, giving him the ability to land strikes that he shouldn't be able to, and make even the best strikers look inferior to him. Even Tebow, who was able to defend every one of Khabib's takedowns, had to worry about him constantly shooting in and clinching with them, making him unable to land any meaningful strikes on him. There's no doubt that Gaethje will be working heavily on his defensive wrestling in preparation for this fight, and if he wants to be successful, he'll have to completely nullify Khabib's threat and establish that the fight won't be taking place anywhere but on the feet. That way he can eliminate the fear of Khabib's ground game and lock in on Khabib's chin. We have seen Khabib rocked by strikes on 2 occasions, once by Michael Johnson and once by Dustin Poirier. Both fighters got overly aggressive when they had Khabib hurt and paid for it when Khabib was able to take them back to the mat. This is where Gaethje's newly found patience and composure can play a huge factor in this bout. When Gaethje had Tony Ferguson rocked, he didn't rush in as he usually had in the past. He continued to counter Tony's strikes and effectively broke him down to the point that the ref had to save him. If Gaethje can hurt Khabib and force him to continue to trade with him, rather than rushing in and getting tied up in Khabib's clinch, he could possibly put Khabib away. Khabib himself can either be aggressive or patient, depending on who he's fighting, but his game plan is always based on getting the fight to the ground. He'll either look to close the distance with a technical striker right away and tie them up against the fence as to nullify their game, or he'll allow an aggressive opponent to chase him with strikes while looking for his openings to shoot in for the takedown. Gaethje has now shown that he can fight either way, and Khabib will have to be cautious about how he approaches him, because Gaethje showed a significant improvement in his timing against Tony, and if he's able to get a read on Khabib's offense, I don't see Khabib being able to eat the same amount of hooks that Tony ate in that fight. Gaethje also has vicious uppercuts that could prove to be deadly if Khabib tries to recklessly shoot in. If Khabib tries to stand back and wait on Gaethje to make a move, Gaethje can possibly goad Khabib in with his leg kicks, but he can't throw them too often, as we've seen Eddie Alvarez be able to time and catch Gaethje's leg kicks in their fight. And while Alvarez had no intention of trying to take Gaethje down, Khabib will be looking for every opportunity for it. Cardio is another big factor to consider in this fight. While both fighters have shown that they can last all 5 rounds, they have to pace themselves in order to get there. Khabib is relentless with his wrestling in the first 2 rounds of each fight and slows down significantly in the third as to get his win back. His takedowns become much easier to defend, but the threat is still there, making it possible for him to still be somewhat effective on the feet. Gaethje's ability to take advantage of this round will rely heavily on how he performs in the first 2. Gaethje was able to make it all 5 rounds against a cardio machine in Tony Ferguson and dominate the majority of the fight all the way to a finish, but he was also able to avoid the type of heavy damage that he took against Eddie Alvarez and Dustin Poirier that took his cardio away in those fights. If Khabib is able to drag Gaethje to the mat in these first 2 rounds and land some heavy ground and pound, he may be able to wear Gaethje out by the 3rd, allowing himself to rebuild his stamina and get right back to the wrestling in the 4th and 5th. If Khabib is not able to take Gaethje to the ground and spends his energy on thwarted takedown attempts, he might pay a heavy price for it in that crucial 3rd round. In the end, I believe that the outcome of this fight all comes down to whether or not Justin Gaethje can keep the fight on the feet and eliminate Khabib's takedown threat. We all pretty much knew that Khabib was going to take Tony Ferguson down. The big question regarding that fight was whether or not Khabib would have been able to nullify Tony's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and avoid being submitted in those scrambles. Gaethje doesn't have anywhere near the same level of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that Tony Ferguson has, or even that of Khabib's past opponents like Dustin Poirier and Al Iaquinta. What Justin Gaethje does have is a wrestling background, and while it's a high-level wrestling background, we really don't have enough solid evidence to decisively say whether or not it will hold up against the grappling phenom in Khabib. At the moment, I have no idea who I think will come out on top in this one, and I'll be very interested to hear everyone else's thoughts leading up to this fight. This is a huge opportunity for Justin Gaethje, as becoming the UFC Lightweight Champion with wins over both Tony Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov, while also being the former World Series of Fighting champion, would make it very hard to argue against him being the greatest lightweight fighter of all time. I just hope that this fight is every bit as exciting as every one of his other fights have been. Again, I thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
You know, he's going to have a hell of a time taking me down. It's not going to be easy for him to take me down, to close the distance, take me down. He's going to get cracked the same way that Tony did coming in. And I'm going to have to be in incredible shape. And yeah, let's go.